Part 2. The basic principles of behavior. To understand how operant conditioning works, we must first understand some basic principles of behavior. The principles of reinforcement, extinction, punishment, and stimulus control can be used to explain the behavior of animals or people. Chapter 3. Reinforcement. What dogs like, what they want to avoid, what they'll walk for. Understanding reinforcement is the key to understanding how learning takes place. From a behaviorist perspective, each day is made up of a series of behaviors that are either reinforced or not reinforced. This is true for both animals and humans. The reinforcement that occurs, along with the strength and timing of that reinforcement, will determine whether the behaviors are likely to occur again. A stimulus is any object or event that can be detected by the senses and that can affect a person's or an animal's behavior. The side note says reinforcement occurs when a behavior, followed by a consequent stimulus, is strengthened or becomes more likely to occur again. Stimuli, the plural of stimulus, can be sounds, food or drinks, smells, touches, or visual signals. In dog training, trainers are said to be providing reinforcement when they provide consequences that increase or maintain a behavior. Some examples of stimuli that affect behavior in dogs include verbal commands, encouraging noises, clickers or whistles, food, treats, pats, or snaps on a leash. In operant conditioning, reinforcement can be categorized as either primary or secondary, or as either positive or negative. Let's take a look at what these variables really mean. Primary reinforcement will work for food. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that are related to biology. Examples of primary reinforcers include food, drink, some kinds of touch, and sexual contact. When dogs are trained using treats, that is a primary reinforcer. But primary reinforcers are more than food. For some breeds that are innately wired to be visual stimuli seem to be primary reinforcers. Because of selective breeding over many centuries, many sporting dogs are very visually oriented. Some spaniels will look out a window and notice a leaf falling from a tree across the street. Owners of dogs with such finely tuned sensitivities often wonder why their dog isn't paying attention in an outdoor obedience class. "I'm giving him treats," they tell us, not understanding that for this dog, a treat just can't compete with the field full of birds across the road. The side note above says a reinforcer is a stimulus that, when presented following a behavior, causes that behavior to be more likely to occur again in the future. Secondary reinforcement. Good boy. Secondary reinforcers are reinforcers that can be related to social conditions. In other words, they have a cultural context. Humans respond to secondary reinforcers such as praise, smiles, thumbs up, gestures, and money. Dogs are social creatures, and many dogs also respond well to smiles, praise, attention, clapping, toys, and pats. But just as we have to learn that thumbs up means well done, dogs have to learn that praise is something positive. Verbal praise is the most commonly used secondary reinforcer. When a dog is a young puppy, saying "good girl" to her has no meaning. It's just a bunch of sounds. But when you say "good girl" and give her a piece of food or a pet, she learns to associate praise with good things. Praise has become a secondary reinforcer. The side note here says secondary reinforcers become reinforcing by being paired with primary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcers are also called conditioned reinforcers. This is because secondary reinforcers depend upon some conditioning taking place. For example, if a dog owner takes the leash out of a particular drawer just before taking her dog for a walk, taking the leash out of the drawer can become a conditioned reinforcer. If one day the dog is chewing on a shoe when she takes out the leash, chewing on a shoe may accidentally become reinforced. The dog may think that going for a walk is its reward for chewing on the shoe. In place of verbal praise, some trainers use sounds as conditioned reinforcers that essentially mean "good job." In marine mammal shows, at places like SeaWorld, when the porpoise trainers blow a whistle to let the animal know it has performed correctly, the trainers are delivering conditioned reinforcement. Conditioned reinforcement is a way a trainer can offer reinforcement from a distance and when it is not handy to give food to the animal. Applause is another conditioned reinforcer for both human performers and many competition dogs. The side note says a conditioned reinforcer is a previously neutral stimulus that begins to function as a reinforcer after being paired a number of times with an established reinforcer. Now we're clicking. Recently, the dog training community has seen an increase in the use of clicker training, which uses the clicker as a conditioned reinforcer. The clicker is a small metal and plastic device that makes a clicking sound. Clickers have been around for decades. Years ago, they were called crickets and were sold as children's toys. When clickers are used as conditioned reinforcers, the dog is first given food alone as a primary reinforcer. Once the dog has clearly shown that it likes food, the pairing begins. The clicker is clicked, then the food is given. Because the clicking sound is associated with the delivery of food, the click alone begins to take on reinforcing properties. You'll find more information about clicker training in Chapter 14. The clicker is a conditioned reinforcer because it started out as a neutral stimulus, meaning it had no meaning for the dog. But when it was paired with food, the dog eventually learned that a clicker also means good job. The side note here says clicker training is one application of conditioned reinforcement. The clicker is a neutral stimulus that is followed by a primary reinforcer and eventually becomes a conditioned reinforcer. How reinforcement becomes conditioned. Symbols for explaining conditioning. SD equals the cue, fetch the paper. R equals the response, fetching the paper. SN equals the neutral stimulus, good dog. SR plus equals the primary reinforcer, dog biscuits. Step 1, SD to R to SN to SR plus. In the presence of the cue, fetch the paper, Laddie emits the response, fetching the paper, and is immediately given the neutral stimulus, good dog, which is then followed by the primary reinforcer, dog biscuits. This is done several times. Step 2, SD to R to SR plus. The neutral stimulus, after several repetitions, becomes a conditioned reinforcer, SR plus, capable of acting as a primary reinforcer. Step 3, for the conditioned reinforcer to maintain its effectiveness, it should be followed occasionally, such as every 3rd to 10th time, by the primary reinforcer, food. Positive reinforcement will still work for food. Reinforcement can also be described as positive or negative, something an animal wants to acquire more of or something it wants to escape from or avoid. The delivery of a positive reinforcer results in positive reinforcement. Here are some examples of positive reinforcement. Sugar was an English Cocker Spaniel being trained for obedience. In obedience competition, dogs are expected to sit straight in front of their owners at a precise 90-degree angle, and are penalized for crooked sits. Sugar was sitting straight only some of the time in obedience routines. During training, Sugar's owner began giving her a small piece of dog food when she sat straight, and no food when she sat crooked. Within a few sessions, Sugar was sitting straight. The side note says, a positive reinforcer is a stimulus that, when presented following a behavior, makes it more likely that type of behavior will occur in the future. The dog situation was that Sugar was a spaniel being trained for obedience. The dog behavior, Sugar would come to her owner and sit crooked some of the time. Trainer response, give treats for straight sits. Food equals primary positive reinforcement. And the result or consequences is that straight sits increase. Sam was a 5-year-old Vizsla whose owner decided to take him to non-competitive field dog training classes as a leisure activity. Sam was initially more interested in his owner than in finding the birds. In training, as he began to move away from his owner's side in the correct direction, she would excitedly say, good boy, Sam." Sam began wagging his tail and moving forward to find the birds. Dog situation, Sam was a Vizsla being trained for field work. Dog behavior, Sam was more interested in his owner than in finding birds. Trainer response, trainer would excitedly say, good boy, good Sam, when Sam moved away from her toward the hidden birds. Praise equals secondary positive reinforcement. The results or consequences, Sam began moving out to find the birds. Cody was a German Shepherd that worked full-time as a drug detection dog. Some nights, Cody had to search cars in an airport parking lot. When he stayed on task and completed his searches, his trainer gave him his toy, a knotted towel that could be used to play tug-of-war. Cody's trainer decided that they could complete their evening duties faster if the playtime was eliminated. Soon after, Cody's searching and on-task behavior decreased. Cody's trainer restored playtime as a reward for searching, and Cody's on-task behavior improved. Dog situation: Cody was a German Shepherd involved in drug detection work. Dog behavior: Cody's searching behavior decreased when playtime was eliminated. Trainer response: trainer resumed playtime following searches. Play and toy equals secondary positive reinforcement. Results or consequences: Cody's on-task behavior improved. The positive reinforcers in these three examples are food, praise, and a toy. What makes these items positive reinforcers is the effect each had on the behavior of the dog. In each case, the desired behavior increased when the positive stimulus was presented following the behavior. Given treats, sugars, sits improved. When Sam was praised, he began moving in the desired direction. If a toy was offered after searches, Cody stayed on task and searched. The important thing to remember about positive reinforcement is that it must seem positive to the dog. Some dogs couldn't care less about a trainer saying "good boy." Dogs that eat dinner at 6 p.m. and go to obedience class at 7 p.m. may not find treats particularly reinforcing in class. If a dog has free access to a particular toy, that toy may not be a positive reinforcer. If you deliver what you think is a reinforcer and it does not result in the desired behavior, it's possible that what you think is a reinforcer and what the dog thinks is a reinforcer are two different things. The side note says, positive reinforcement can be used to improve proficiency, teach new skills, and maintain existing behavior. Negative reinforcement. Escape feels good. Negative reinforcement can be a confusing concept. Many people equate it with punishment, but these two operant conditioning principles are very different. Very simply put, negative reinforcement is used to get the dog to do something more often. Punishment gets the dog to stop doing something. Punishment decreases the probability that a behavior will occur again. That is, if a dog is punished for a behavior and the punisher is effective, the dog will be less likely to engage in the punished behavior in the future. Negative reinforcement, like positive reinforcement, will increase the likelihood that a behavior will occur again. So what's the difference? With positive reinforcement, a positive stimulus is used, such as food, toys, or petting. With negative reinforcement, a negative stimulus is removed, conditioning an escape response. For example, some dogs are trained to heel with a chain training collar. When the dog lags behind the handler gives a snap-release correction on the collar. If the dog feels or hears the handler starting to make the correction and hurries to get into the heel position to avoid the correction, negative reinforcement has taken place. The side note says, with negative reinforcement, the probability of a behavior occurring in the future is increased when the behavior is followed by the removal or avoidance of a negative stimulus. Reinforcement categories and sample stimuli. Primary reinforcers or unconditioned reinforcers, and positive reinforcement is presentation of food, drink, exercise, smells, and petting. Primary reinforcers and negative reinforcement is removal of shock, such as a shock collar, pain, such as an ear pinch, and other things such as heat or a bright light. Secondary reinforcers, which are conditioned reinforcers, and positive reinforcement is presentation of toys, praise, such as good dog, and attention, such as petting. Secondary reinforcers and negative reinforcement is removal of bad dog, no, threatening tone of voice, threatening gesture, such as a raised hand. Like secondary reinforcement, negative reinforcement must be conditioned. In other words, the dog has to have been exposed to some punishment and understand it as a negative experience. In the case of the training collar, there must be at least one experience where the dog actually receives the jerk on the collar and finds it unpleasant. When the dog hurries into heel position to avoid the jerk, learning has taken place. Positive and negative. How can that be? Some stimuli in the environment are positive reinforcers for some people and dogs, and negative reinforcers for others. Heavy metal music blaring from a boombox at the beach may be a positive reinforcer for some teenagers, while others of us may respond to the same music by leaving the beach. For those who find the escape from the music a relief, it's a negative reinforcer. Individual dogs of the same breed can be as different as two people, one who likes loud music and another who detests it. and different breeds of dogs react differently to different stimuli. In dog training, selecting an effective reinforcement strategy depends on both your knowledge of behavioral principles and a good understanding of the individual dog. You can also make choices about using neutral stimuli as positive or negative reinforcers. Some stimuli that are traditionally thought of as positive reinforcers may be used as negative reinforcers in dog training. Clickers are most often used as positive conditioned reinforcers. Paired with a food treat, clickers give the dog the message that it has behaved correctly. In a less traditional approach, some trainers use clickers to warn the dog that it must stop what it is doing. As with the positive approach, the clicker must initially be paired with a negative experience to make it function as a negative reinforcer. Escape conditioning. Okay, I'll say uncle. Negative reinforcement works by making use of escape conditioning and avoidance conditioning. In escape conditioning, a response is more likely to occur in the future if the negative stimulus is removed immediately after the response. Here's an example. Star was a Labrador retriever being trained to work as a service dog. As part of her training, she had to learn to hold a wooden dumbbell as the first step in learning how to retrieve. However, Star refused to take the dumbbell in her mouth. She clenched her teeth shut and would not give in. Her trainer used a common procedure of holding the dumbbell up to her mouth and then pinching her ear. When Star opened her mouth to take the dumbbell, her ear was released and she was praised for taking it. The side note says, in escape conditioning, escape comes after the aversive event has occurred. The dog situation, Star was a Labrador retriever that had to learn to hold the dumbbell. Dog behavior, Star clenched her teeth and refused to take the dumbbell in her mouth. Trainer response, trainer held the dumbbell at her mouth and pinched her ear. Pinch equals negative reinforcement escape conditioning. Result or consequences, Star opened her mouth, took the dumbbell, and was praised. Avoidance conditioning, a warning. In avoidance conditioning, if a behavior can prevent a negative stimulus from occurring, the behavior increases in frequency. In order for this to happen, the dog must know that the negative stimulus is coming and must know what it can do to avoid the negative stimulus. This requires conditioning. An example is Buddy, a basset hound whose owner wanted to take him for short walks in the neighborhood. But Buddy was more interested in his surroundings than in walking, and would stop every few feet to sniff and smell. It makes walks tedious. His owner responded by making a loud nasal sound that sounded a bit like a sneeze every time Buddy stopped. The noise was always followed by a jerk on the leash. When Buddy started walking, he was praised. After several corrections, Buddy understood that the noise came just before a correction, and the praise taught him that he was supposed to be walking. So whenever he heard the noise, he kept walking in order to avoid the correction. The side note says, in avoidance conditioning, avoidance occurs before the aversive event takes place. Dog situation, Buddy's owner wanted to take him for short walks. Dog behavior, Buddy stopped to sniff every 4 feet. Trainer response, his owner made a loud noise, followed by a jerk on the leash. Every time Buddy stopped, noise plus jerk equals negative reinforcement avoidance conditioning. Results or consequences, Buddy started walking whenever he heard the noise and was praised. In Buddy's case, he learned to avoid the jerk on the leash by responding to the warning sound. This is a situation where a knowledge of breeds is critical to providing a solution that is fair and humane to the dog. Bassets are scent hounds and were bred for centuries for their abilities to trail small game by using their sense of smell. Buddy's owner began using 2 different leashes and collars to teach Buddy that there were times when he needed to keep walking and times when he could engage in his favorite leisure time activity, smelling. When Buddy wore his chain collar and leather leash, it told him he would be required to keep moving. When he wore his nylon collar and leash, he was free to take his time and investigate the local smells. Sometimes even dogs need to take time to smell the roses. Schedules of reinforcement. Which ones and how many? To teach a dog a new behavior, improve the proficiency of a previously learned behavior, or maintain a behavior, you must know how to use reinforcement effectively. That means understanding what kind of reinforcement is suitable in a particular training situation, and also knowing how and when to deliver that reinforcement. In operant conditioning, the rules pertaining to how many or which specific responses will be reinforced are called schedules of reinforcement. The side note says, schedules of reinforcement define which responses will be reinforced and how often. Understanding reinforcement can improve training effectiveness. For example, if a puppy is being taught to sit, should you deliver a reinforcer every time the puppy sits on command, every second time, every 10th time, or randomly? It really does make a difference. Reinforcers can be given for every single correct response, or for only some correct responses. When a behavior is reinforced every time it occurs, it's called continuous reinforcement. In training a puppy to sit, if you give the pup a small piece of food for every correct sit, the puppy is on a continuous reinforcement schedule. Continuous reinforcement is an excellent tool to use while training a new skill, but it should eventually be faded to a more functional level. The ultimate goal of training is to make the dog as independent as possible, and a dog expecting continuous reinforcement will not perform without the reinforcer. When responses are reinforced only some of the time, it's called intermittent reinforcement. If the puppy is learned to sit on command and responds to the verbal cue, sit, most of the time, you might choose to give a food reward only some of the time. This is enough to reinforce the behavior, but not enough to make the behavior dependent on the reinforcer. Intermittent reinforcement schedules can get pretty complex. There are 6 types: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval, fixed duration, and variable duration. Fixed ratio schedules. In a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, the same number of responses must be performed before a reinforcer is given. In the example we just used, you might decide to reward the dog for every 3rd sit or every 5th sit, or whatever number you specify. Some factory workers are paid on a fixed schedule. This is called piecework. For example, if the workers are paid $1 for every 10 items they assemble, they're being rewarded every 10th time they perform the desired behavior. The side note says, fixed ratio schedules are sometimes abbreviated as FR in a number, so FR4 means the dog is on a fixed ratio schedule where it is rewarded every 4th time. Some things to remember about fixed ratio schedules. Number 1, they're easy to use. It's easy to remember when to deliver reinforcement because it's on a fixed schedule. Number 2, many competitive dog events have the same preset routines, so fixed ratio schedules can be used to teach the whole routine. Number 3, since a fixed ratio schedule is predictable and fixed, dogs learn when reinforcement is coming. That means when several responses are required for the dog to earn reinforcement, the dog may hesitate immediately after the reinforcer is given before engaging in the next behavior. Variable ratio schedules. In variable ratio schedules, reinforcement is delivered after a certain number of responses that vary unpredictably. Well-known variable ratio schedules of reinforcement for humans includes slot machines, fishing, and the lottery. Each of these activities pays off only after an unpredictable number of responses have occurred. Because of the unpredictability of the reinforcers, variable ratio schedules have the power to keep the animal, whether it is a human or dog, performing for a long period of time. They are random reinforcement, and we all want to keep playing to see when the next reinforcer will come. Side note says, variable ratio schedules can also be abbreviated. In a VR4 schedule, the number of responses required before reinforcement is given varies, but the average number of responses is 4. Some things to remember about variable ratio schedules. Number 1, the animal will perform at a consistently high rate. Number 2, if you stop giving the reinforcer, the behavior that has been reinforced on a variable ratio schedule continues for a longer period of time than with other schedules. And number 3, beginning trainers may find it harder to use a variable ratio schedule. In attempting to randomize reinforcement, inexperienced trainers often spread the schedule of reinforcement so thin that the dog stops responding. Fixed interval schedules. In a fixed interval schedule, a specified amount of time must pass before the animal is given the reinforcer. Fixed interval schedules are most commonly used in laboratory settings, often to study the effects of certain drugs over time. The time in fixed interval schedules is usually expressed in minutes. For example, in an FI3 schedule, the animal is reinforced for the first response after 3 minutes have passed. In the real world, most fixed interval schedules related to dogs occur in hours rather than minutes. Dogs fed at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. every day are on a fixed interval schedule of 12 hours. Dogs that go with their owner to fetch the paper that is delivered at 6 a.m. every morning are on a 24-hour fixed interval schedule. The side note says, ratio schedules set a number of responses that must occur before a reinforcement is given. Interval schedules set an interval of time that must pass before reinforcement is given. Some things to remember about fixed interval schedules. Number 1, they are more suitable for laboratory research with rats and pigeons than in dog training. Number 2, they are often confused with fixed duration schedules. Number 3, after the reinforcer is given in a fixed interval schedule, there is usually a pause in the animal's responses. Number 4, performance with fixed interval schedules is less consistent than with fixed or variable ratio schedules. Variable interval schedules. Like fixed interval schedules of reinforcement, variable interval schedules let some time pass before an animal is reinforced. The difference is that the amount of time varies. When dogs need to stay on a task or behave in a certain way for a period of time, a variable interval schedule might be used. A dog that is not too happy about staying in a crate at a dog show might be reinforced or on a variable interval schedule for quiet, calm behavior in the crate. Dogs that are required to work at a task for a long period of time, such as in a police or search work, might be reinforced on a variable interval schedule. Some things to remember about variable interval schedules. These schedules result in a more consistent performance than fixed interval schedules. Number 2, they require random delivery of reinforcement. Number 3, they may be harder for beginning trainers to use properly. Number 4, there are not many training situations where a variable interval schedule is appropriate. Fixed duration schedules. A less well-known schedule of reinforcement is the fixed duration schedule. With this kind of schedule, a reinforcer is given after behavior has occurred or has been occurring for a certain amount of time. A biweekly paycheck is one example, although it is often mistakenly identified as a fixed interval schedule. In dog training, fixed duration schedules of reinforcement could be used to teach the timed stays in obedience competition, such as the 3-minute sit and 5-minute down. If you wish to teach dogs to watch me for extended periods of time, a fixed duration schedule could be used to improve eye contact. Some things to remember about fixed duration schedules. Number 1, they are easy to administer. Number 2, they are different from fixed interval schedules. In fixed interval schedules, the first response after the time has passed is reinforced. In fixed duration schedules, the reinforcer is given if the behavior has been engaged in continuously for the fixed time. Number 3, in a fixed duration schedule, the behavior must occur for the whole time period to be reinforced. For example, if the dog breaks the 3-minute down after 2 minutes, no reinforcer is given. Number 4, fixed duration schedules can be used to produce long periods of continuous performance. Variable duration schedules. In the variable duration schedule, the interval of time that the dog must be engaged in a behavior in order to be reinforced changes unpredictably. For example, a guide dog that has to wait different amounts of time at busy city intersections before helping its owner cross the street is on a variable duration schedule. Some things to remember about variable duration schedules. Number 1, like other variable schedules, these are more difficult for inexperienced trainers to use. And number 2, they result in long periods of continuous performance and do not have the post-reinforcement delays seen in fixed duration schedules. Limited hold. Don't be late. Some dogs work well once they get started, but getting them started is a problem. Limited hold is a principle that relates to both schedules of reinforcement and this problem. A limited hold is a limited window of time during which a response will produce the reinforcer. One example for humans is arriving at the airport to catch a plane. Each flight only accepts passengers for a limited period of time. Late arrival means the reinforcer, the trip, will not be available. Dogs in many performance events must begin a behavior within a certain amount of time after the handler's cue. In advanced obedience exercises, for example, when the handler directs the dog to go out to a specified area for directed jumping, the judge only waits for so long before disqualifying a dog that does not start. Limited hold is used in conjunction with the schedules of reinforcement to give the animal a deadline for performing. After the deadline has passed, there is no reward for the behavior. Limited hold can be used to build quick responses. Establishing operations. This reinforcer looks better to me now. Dogs, like humans, are more likely to respond at certain times to a given reinforcer than at other times. Food rewards are not as appealing immediately after the dog has eaten a large bowl of dog food. A dog that has been in its crate all day may be much more likely to respond to play as a reinforcer than one that has already had several play sessions that day. The effectiveness of a reinforcer is often described in terms of motivation, deprivation, and satiation. Motivation is at the heart of reinforcement. If a dog is not motivated to get something or to get away from something, the item or event cannot act as a reinforcer. An example would be offering a piece of cheese to a dog that dislikes cheese. Deprivation occurs when a reinforcer becomes more powerful after the dog has gone without it for a period of time. An example is a dog being more interested in food when it has missed a meal. Satiation occurs when the dog has had enough of a particular reinforcer, making it less effective. An example is a show dog that got a lot of liver treats in the breed ring. When it enters the next round of competition, the group's liver may have lost some of its appeal. A more accurate term. In 1982, Jack Michael suggested using the term establishing operation, first introduced by Keller and Schoenfield in 1950, rather than the terms satiation and deprivation, because there are some other effects that look like satiation and deprivation but are not. For example, water deprivation results in thirst. However, there are some other things that result in thirst, such as eating too much salt. The result of withholding water and taking in too much salt are the same, but it is not accurate to say that too much salt is related to deprivation. Using Michael's definition, establishing operations are events that alter the value of a reinforcer. They are relevant in dog training because you must be keenly aware of whether or not a reinforcer is effective at a certain time or in a certain situation. The side note says, establishing operations establish the effectiveness of reinforcers at particular times or in particular situations. An example of an establishing operation might be a lengthy play session with a dog's favorite toy just before a training session. That toy would then not be an effective reinforcer because the dog has just had the chance to play with it. Similarly, an active dog that is people-oriented and usually enjoys training may not follow instructions if it has had no exercise during the day and would prefer running over having an obedience lesson. You'll find more information on how establishing operations are used to deal with problem behaviors in Chapter 17. Understanding if reinforcers are effective at a particular time and in a particular situation is one of the most important concepts in dog training. Reinforcement is at the heart of operant conditioning, but you can't reinforce a behavior until you understand what the dog considers reinforcement to be. Reinforcer sampling. There's more where that came from. Reinforcer sampling is one kind of establishing operation. It entails giving the dog a little taste of the reinforcer before training begins. The idea is to get the dog excited and eager to work for something new. For example, you might give the dog 1 or 2 improved tasty liver treats before training begins, in order to whet its appetite for more treats in the training session. The Premack Principle, Grandma's Rule. The Premack Principle, named after researcher David Premack, states that the high probability behavior reinforces low probability behavior. The idea here is that a preferred activity can be used to reinforce some less favored activity. While Premack's work was done with rats and monkeys, the Premack Principle is often discussed in teacher and parent training workshops. In work with humans, the Premack Principle is often referred to as Grandma's Rule because grandmothers sometimes say, if you clean your room, then you can go outside. Dog trainers say that they are using the Premack Principle with the dog when they train first and have a play session later. But technically, the Premack Principle, as it is most commonly taught in education and training settings, would not apply to dogs because the principle requires self-management and understanding what is in one's best desire. However, the Premack Principle can be applied quite nicely to the dog's trainer, who can develop good habits such as training the dog first and playing later. Jackpotting. Let's play the slot machines. Schedules of reinforcement tell trainers when reinforcement is to be delivered, but in addition to knowing when, you also need to decide which reinforcers will be used and how much will be given. Will the dog get 1 tidbit of food, 2 treats, or a whole hot dog? Most of the time, when food is used as a reward, trainers use a small piece of food for each instance of reinforcement. In the literature on animal learning, there is some research related to how factors such as frequency, size, and delay of reinforcement affect the performance of the animal. It seems to suggest that in some situations involving choice, animals will prefer smaller, immediate rewards to larger delayed rewards. Despite this, in recent years, dog trainers have begun using a reward procedure called jackpotting. Like hitting the jackpot at the slot machines in Las Vegas, the term means giving the dog a large, unexpected reinforcer. For example, instead of a small bit of food, the dog might be reinforced with a large handful of food. Trainers say jackpotting results in an animal that is excited and curious about what might be coming next. However, there is not much in the operant research literature to support this. In fact, the experimental literature suggests that if used regularly, larger rewards can create faster responses in the short term, but the animals stop responding faster when these reinforcers are eliminated. As early as 1942, the ideal amount of reinforcement was a topic of interest to researchers. Leo Crespi trained different groups of rats to run along a runway. One group received one food pellet as a reward, one group received 4 pellets, and one group received 16. When they had all learned the behavior and were performing it at about the same rate, he started giving them 1 pellet and 4 pellet groups 16 pellets of food. The result was that the rats ran faster for a few trials. Crespi called this the elation effect and suggested that it caused more pellets to look better. In another experiment, when rats were given 256 pellets as a reward and were later given just 16 pellets, they began to underperform. Crespi called this depression. The use of terms like elation and depression is a good example of a scientist using emotional interpretations and cognitive explanations for a behavior. Since there was no way for Crespi to really know what the rats were thinking or feeling, he was also not being very accurate. The terms elation and depression are therefore no longer used. Instead, when describing these effects, researchers call them positive and negative contrast effects. Crespi's work suggests that jackpotting can have some short-term effect. In human equivalents, jackpotting is like expecting a card on Valentine's Day and getting a big diamond ring instead. While you might be absolutely ecstatic, the implications for your future behavior are not clear. So it is with the ongoing benefits of jackpotting. When new procedures are introduced in the dog training world, everyone wants to get on the bandwagon. One trainer told us she was having a hard time teaching her dogs some of the advanced obedience exercises, so she was using the jackpotting method. She went on to describe how she was jackpotting the dog with food every day in every training session. We were tempted to ask her how much the dog weighs, but we did suggest that constant jackpotting takes away the elements of delight and surprise, likely diminishing the value of the jackpot. Dog trainers are quick to say dogs are not rats when they see behavioral research, and this is true. Jackpotting is an interesting procedure for which controlled research should be done on dogs being trained. While animals may appear excited when a jackpot is presented, and this excitement makes trainers feel great, the long-term, lasting effects of jackpotting on canine behavior are as yet unknown. Any result that is observed as a result of jackpotting is not so much operant conditioning as it is the contrast effect. The important thing to remember about jackpotting is that if a trainer chooses to use it and it is overused, it can diminish the effects of standard reinforcers. Reinforcer assessment. What does this dog like? People are different. We have different preferences about the foods we eat, the cars we drive, and the styles of homes in which we live. Some of us wouldn't walk across the street to watch a football game, even if the best 2 teams in the country were playing and the admission was free. Others have no interest in seeing a ballet or visiting an art gallery. As unbelievable as it seems, not everyone loves chocolate. Some people are motivated to earn as much money as possible. For others, having free time is more important than having money. Dogs are no different. Breed differences, learning histories, and specific environmental and physical conditions all play a part in determining which stimuli will work as reinforcers for a particular dog. When dogs are having learning problems, you may want to conduct a reinforcer assessment. Rather than assuming something is a reinforcer for the dog, you can use a reinforcer assessment to observe and record the dog's actual responses to specific stimuli. Good trainers experiment with a variety of reinforcers and have an understanding of each individual dog. For dogs that are very people-oriented, the attention that goes along with training may be a big reinforcer. For other dogs that are not so people-oriented, ending the training session may be reinforcing. The reinforcer assessment can be used to identify a dog's preferred reinforcers. What does it all mean? No matter how many times we've heard it, we're still taken aback when someone tells us, I tried operant conditioning and it didn't work with my dog. Operant conditioning does work. There's no doubt about it. Some trainers may not be using the procedures correctly, consequently, they may not be seeing the results they'd like. Operant conditioning is a science that comes complete with a difficult body of knowledge to master and apply with skill. One book, a few seminars, and a video or two will not make anyone an expert in operant conditioning. But when there are problems in training, trainers who at least have a knowledge of the basic principles can begin to analyze their animal's performance problems. The principles of reinforcement we've discussed in this chapter teach us that for maximum effectiveness, the right reinforcers must be identified for each individual dog. The reinforcers need to be delivered on the appropriate schedule, and finally, training is not finally finished until reinforcement has been faded and conditioned reinforcers established so that the dog can work reliably, consistently, and happy for a long time to come. So this page is a canine reinforcer assessment example. So when trainers are not sure strong reinforcers have been identified for an individual dog, the following assessment can be administered. If the dog appears to be losing interest, stimuli should be presented over several sessions. Some stimuli can be used several times during training. Others are suitable as post-training session rewards. Directions is check each response that occurs.